Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Andrew, and I'm part of the marketing team over at SEO Ranking. And today we are joined by Jono Alderson. I'll say a couple of words about him a bit later on. And today we're going to talk about schema markup beyond the basics. Just before we start, let me just make sure that people can see and hear us in the chat. So find that chat and let us know where you guys are joining us from today. There's going to be a short delay, but we'll give it some time for people to let us know if everything is good on their end. Yeah, we already have a couple of messages from Ellen, Marius, Damgard, Digital. Let's see if we have any. Okay, hi from Romania, the UK, York, Chris. So I'm guessing everything is good on our end and we can start our presentation. A lot of us marketers and SEOs aren't really technical SEO wizards, but it's important to be able to get technical when you have to. Adding structured data, also known as schema markup, to your site is one of the more technical things marketers do. Word has it, it can give you a significant SEO boost and increase your rankings. In a nutshell, structured data is a type of code that makes it easier for search engines to crawl, organize, and display content. It communicates to search engines what your data means. Without schema markup, search engines can only tell what your data says, but they have a harder time trying to figure out what it means. Today, we're joined an expert in the field, Jono Alderson, who is a digital strategist. Strategist.
Sorry, my fault.
Yeah, but it's not even a tongue twister, and I got that wrong. Marketing technologist and full stack developer. He is an expert in digital strategy. Oh my God, what's wrong with this? Strategy, SEO analytics, WordPress, web performance, structured data, marketing technology, conversion rate optimization, growth, PHP, CSS, and a whole lot more. Jono currently manages special projects at Yoast. He was previously principal consultant at a respected SEO agency, Distilled. Prior to that, he was global head of digital and head of insight at SEO platform LinkDex and head of SEO at award-winning agency 26. So before I give the word over to Jono, I want to tell everyone that we will have a replay sent to your inbox. You can also catch it on YouTube. Plus, we will have an offer at the very end for those of you who make it. Who stick around, yeah. We'll talk about that at the very end. Plus, if you have any questions, just throw them into the chat. I will keep my eye on the chat, and we will have a Q&A session. Where we will try to address all of your questions, guys. So, without further ado, Jono, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful and verbose introduction. Yeah, strategy is an oddly difficult word sometimes, isn't it? And an oddly difficult thing. That's awesome. I see so many people from so many interesting different places, but one stood out. There's somebody else from York here. I'm in York right now, my hometown. I've never met anybody in York who's even heard of the internet, so this is lovely. Very nice. Right, okay, so we've got, 45 minutes plus some Q&A to talk through everything you ever need to know about schema. That's going to be quite intense. Let's share this screen, shall we? Let's see if I can get this to work first time. Share screen, screen 2, ping. Yes, magical. Right, thank you very much, Andrew. Let's do this. So, over the last few years, structured data and schema.org has become one of the hot topics in SEO. But in many cases, people are only really seeing and interacting with the very tip of the iceberg, which means they're missing out on tactical opportunities, strategic, there we go, that's how we say that, strategic opportunities, and more importantly, maybe the bigger picture and the philosophical opportunities. So I'm going to try and give you a bit of a broader, deeper view than much of what you'll be able to find in the SEO sphere. But first, we're going to start off with some history and some context to get everybody onto the same page. This is schema.org. It is both the website for schema.org and the standard of Schema.org, and it launched in 2011 as a collaboration between Google, Bing, Yahoo, and later Yandex. It defined, as Andrew said, a methods, a code, a language which developers and content publishers could use to structure and describe their content specifically in great detail. So instead of relying on search engines to crawl and analyze and parse and guess what your pages are about, you could use structured data in the form of Schema.org to tell them specifically, this is my price, these are the ingredients, this is the opening hours, this is the author, and the relationships between all of these things and these entities. For example, this is an event, and you are the audience of this event, a property of that event. And if we wanted to go deeper, we could think of each of you individually as attendees, and me maybe as the composer and director of this presentation. And if you had any questions at the end, you might consider yourself a contributor. And if we were trying to describe all of this to Google or Facebook or Bing or any of these other systems, this is the kind of language we can use to communicate that. Fast forward 10 years to nowish, Schema.org has matured a lot. And Google and others are pushing really, really hard and incentivizing broad adoption. They provide explicit rewards for using this kind of markup in the form of rich results, access to new verticals, and types of rankings and listings and results which are hard to achieve without using structured data. For example, in this image, you can see Schema.org markup on the left describing a product that has images and reviews and a description, and on the right, an example of how that manifests is as a rich result with cards and star ratings, or as an image format where you can click and buy the product directly. Google are keen on promoting us adopting this because it helps them to understand the web. They want to help us to adopt, to implement, and to continually expand and grow their consumption of this type of data. Now, over the course of the last 18 months or so, if you happen to go to Google's developer search updates page and have a look at all of the things they've announced that they've changed or added, it's no coincidence that about 3/4 of all of those updates relate to Schema. I've color-coded them in the background. All of the blue updates relate to Schema.org and structured data, adding tools, updating documentation, clarifying edge cases, expanding coverage, giving examples. They add things like shipping details, adopt and pioneer new techniques of describing more advanced scenarios and information around your web pages and content. They're doing this because it allows them to improve their core service. And when you think about what Google's core service and proposition is, it's not crawling the web, it's not indexing, it's not even ranking, and it's increasingly not the search results page as we consider it. Their core proposition is solving the problems of their users. And increasingly, the way that manifests isn't in a list of links on a search results page. It's on something that might look more like this. These are examples in the background from an SEO tool called Systrix, who categorize over 40 different types of search results which they'd seen across their data sets. I should point out that SE Ranking has very similar capabilities. I just happen to have this screenshot handy. But these are things like cards, tools, widgets, and answers. Fewer and fewer of the search results that we're competing to rank in look like lists of links. And structured data is a critical key component for how we fight for discoverability and visibility in these environments. Now, to provide these kinds of results, Google needs to do more than just crawl the web and extract the content that they find. They need to understand what they're consuming. And they get that understanding from Schema.org markup. Makes sense, right? So, of course, we're predictable. The SEO industry chases the shinies. We look for opportunities to frame our content nicely in the search results, to access those verticals and formats, to get the additional click-through rate and competitive visibility, and in some cases, to bypass conventional ranking constraints and processes. We use Schema.org to describe our products, our reviews, our FAQs, our shipping and delivery details, using Google's documentation for where they provide those rewards as a way of starting and prioritizing. This is fine. This is a good way to get a tactical advantage over your competitors who aren't doing this. And this is what everybody's doing. If you want to take part in these ecosystems and compete, you have to be using this kind of data. However, this is just the beginning. There is a lot more that you can do, which frankly, nobody is taking advantage of still. As of mid-October last year, Google only supported about 30 types of schema. That number hasn't increased considerably. It's about 34 now, depending on how you count it. Schema.org, the website and the standard, defines almost 1,500 different types of thing. That is a big gap. Things like consume action, which can be used to describe when things are consumed, not just food, but content. And types of consumption include viewing, watching, buying, responding, commenting, some of which might change how your content might be presented by Google in other systems, like buttons in Gmail, for example, where I can quickly say watch video or respond to comment. Schema like business audience, which allows you to define demographics, company sizes and revenue thresholds, geographic areas. If you have B2B products or just B2B content, you can use this to describe who it's for. And you can use subtypes. For many of the things in Schema.org that Google rewards, like products and web pages and articles, there are actually much more specific types of those things. Rather than just having an event, you might have a social event or a sale event, and these things have different properties. Rather than just having a web page, you might have an item page. Aside from better representing your content, these types unlock additional schema properties which can be valuable in other ways, which we'll come on to. And you might also have multitypes. This is one of my favourite books, but for the context of this talk, it's much more interesting because it's two different things, or many different things. It is a book and a product. It has chapters and an author, but also a price and product reviews. From Google's perspective, we can describe our things as multiple things and make them eligible for multiple different types of results. And Google is surprisingly flexible and good when it comes at parsing and understanding these multi-typed relationships. And if you want to get really deep, some types of things are already inherently either multi-typed or subtyped. For example, local business schema, which is one of the tactical ones that we all chase after, is actually technically a multi-type of organization and place schema. And if you go even deeper, local business might have more specific subtypes like dentist or park, which in turn might be multi-typed, and so on and so forth. This is a rabbit hole. Before we go any further, we really ought to be asking ourselves, how significant is all of this? Is it enough to drop everything else that you're doing and just focus on schema.org? We're looking for tactical opportunities, right? Well, I stole this slide from my good friend Izzy Smith, who was quoting John Mueller from Google speaking at SMX last year, talking about structured data. And he says, I really like this quote, "Even without the structured data leading to rich results, our systems profit's an interesting word for Google, isn't it? By understanding, and there's the really interesting word, the page better when they use structured data." The key word here is understanding. Why is this important? Because when I ask something like this, whether I type it into a search box or ask my Google Assistant or whatever the mechanism is, let's look at how their system works without that understanding. They can go and query their index, they can go and see what content they know about, and they can say, we think that this web page should rank first. They can understand that this page is about changing a flat tire. They don't need schema.org to do that or structured data. They can understand that it's a pretty reasonable resource. The content looks okay. It's got some links. It's not too slow. It has a list of things I'll need. It has specific steps I need to take. But look at this search result. This is pretty dumb. In fact, it's a bit rubbish. The problem is it doesn't understand how to change a tire. And the problem I wanted to solve as a user wasn't help me select a web page. It was help me change my flat tire. But all that Google can do at the moment is provide a kind of advert from the source material. They've taken the web page and scraped it and taken its content and represented that as a kind of summary that just says, yes, this might be a reasonable resource. And this is flawed. It's subject to the HTML markup of the source material, the grammatical errors, the poorly structured steps. Imagine a better version of this experience, an interactive widget which walked me through the process. Google cannot become a reliable personal assistant by simply crawling and scraping and representing some kind of soupy advert from the content it finds on web pages, no matter how good it is at entity recognition. And if we zoom out for a moment, it's worth thinking that fancier search results have never been Google's endgame. They're a stepping stone in a much bigger strategy of trying to become what they refer to as the Star Trek computer, where Google Assistant, regardless of whether it's running on your phone or your TV or in your browser, just solves your problems. To do this, Google needs the context that they're lacking. It's not just enough to extract content from the web and understand it in the abstract. They need specific information about the things the pages they consume are talking about. Critically, that context comes from you, your business, your products and services, your content, the entities which you want to represent and describe in a certain way, anything that you want to tell a story about. And in fact, the more you look at Google's challenges, the more you realize that it's not better understanding that they need at all. It is our context and our stories. Let's look at an example. Storytelling is the difference between this page is about a blue widget and there's some pricing info, and this page is about a specific blue widget sold by this company which has these images and this stock level and this review which was written by this reviewer who works for this company who sells this product for this price, which is available at these locations, which have these opening hours, etc., etc. We're not talking about blue widgets in the abstract or general, we're talking about this blue widget and its relationship to the web page it's on and the company who sells it and the people who reviewed it. And as these stories expand, these relationships and those specifics are harder for Google to magically infer. They need to be described. We need to use structured data to tell our stories. Google doesn't have our context and can't easily infer it by just scraping public user-facing content on the web. You have many of these stories and they're all interwoven. You have a host of different pieces playing different roles, and some of them turn up in different places. You can describe these networks of connections. Now, critically, will describing your content in that level of depth give you prettier search results? Maybe not. But it will, as we've learned from John Mueller, help Google to understand our story more specifically. And if Google's mission is to organize and then, yes, reprocess and represent the world's information, if your brand needs to manage how they access and consume and present that information to influence how people perceive you, there is a name for this. In any other vertical, we would call this marketing, where we control the narrative, where we craft the story, where we use every resource that we have to manage that narrative between us and our audience. And in a world where Google is getting better and better at judging the underlying quality of product market fit, and where it's using the context we provide to understand our brands and products and stories, that narrative is the only thing we control. We have to take full advantage of it. Nobody's thinking like this. They're implementing itty-bitty tactical bits of disparate schema markup. Here's my FAQ list. Here's my recipe. Here are my restaurant's opening hours. They're relying on Google to join the dots between the entities they reference and the things they define, hoping that Google will magically infer the relationships and understand the stories we're trying to tell about our websites, brands, people, and products. And Google can't. They can extract, they can classify, they can cross-reference, but they can't understand unless we give them our stories. In most cases, the problem is that schema works something like this in your CMS. If you're using a content management system and the way you control your schema output looks something like this, then maybe you have a problem. Most approaches allow you to say, this page is an article, or this page is a book, and then maybe fill in some fields to describe it. Well, why is that a problem? Let's look at an example. This is a screenshot of classyschema.org. This is an excellent schema visualization tool by a chap called Tony McCreath, who is an absolute rock star. And he has some example schema markup in it. You can see that visualized on the right. It's the kind of thing you might see an SEO implement on a site. And you can see, if you look hard, there are 3 distinct groups of things. There's a list of videos, an FAQ page, and a how-to guide. And this is really the problem. The schema here doesn't describe the relationship between these things. It doesn't tell the story. It doesn't say, this is a web page that contains a how-to guide about this thing that has this guide that contains these images that's all connected together. This is just copy-pasted schema to make the page eligible for specific tactical rich results. This, however, is a much better example. This is a recent blog post from Yoast.com, run through the same tool, and you can see the difference. This is one cohesive story. We're describing a network of related, connected things. This is an article which contains a how-to guide, which is written by a person, which is the main entity of a web page, which is on a website, which is published by an organization, which has this address, and so on and so on. All of these things have their own properties and relationships, and the graph tells the entire story of that page, and everything on it, and everything which is connected to those things. Why is that important? because it's normal for a page to have multiple things. A page isn't a recipe. A page isn't a product. A product page on a website has media, has descriptions, has reviews, has prices, has availability, has delivery information, has information about the manufacturer, the deliverer, the distributor, all of this information. That's the kind of understanding that Google need in order to do awesome stuff. And they're starting to say as much in their documentation. They say that if you have a recipe and a video, you should connect them and link them so that they can understand the relationships. So, how do you do all of this? Strap in, seatbelts on. I'm going to show you 3 slides of code. I promise that's all. Just so you get the basics and the premise. All schema boils down to when you're doing it well and doing it right, it boils down to this approach. This is your starting point. This is an approach we've designed at Yoast. It's what we refer to as the base graph. This describes your web page, your website, and your organization. Pretty simple, right? You have a web page, a website, and the company who publishes them. Each of these, we give an ID. Here's the organization in yellow, here's the website in blue, here's the web page in magenta. And we cross-reference them. We define their relationships using those IDs. This organization publishes this website. This web page is part of this website. Everything we do is just based on saying, here is a thing, it has an ID, it is related to these other things in these ways. This is really straightforward, really easy to scale. It takes a little learning to get used to the syntax, but building out these more sophisticated relationships is really surprisingly straightforward. The missing piece in this puzzle is what happens, the logic around how and when and where individual pieces of schema should be output. The business logic, for want of a better phrase. For example, if a page has an author, but that person doesn't have an avatar, then I can no longer have a valid article schema. And if I can't have valid article schema, some of the relationships between the web page and the article should change. And if my organization doesn't have a logo, then I can't be a valid publisher of a web page. So you need to have documentation on how all of these edge cases and scenarios should behave. Otherwise, your graph falls apart and all those relationships fall apart and you're back in the position we said initially, which is that you're just describing individual things. You still need to stitch all these relationships together. However, frustratingly, Schema.org doesn't consider or define any of that logic. They just define how things can be related, not how they should be related based on real-world context. So you will be very pleased to know that I have spent literally hundreds of hours documenting all of that for all of the major schema types. And you can browse that on developer.yoast.com. There's a left sidebar that has a schema section that has all of the information. And one of the things that solves for that in particular is the hierarchy of elements. If I have an image on a page, should that be related to the web page or the article or both? What happens if it's a Tuesday? What happens if the image is too small? What happens if the image is also the avatar of the organization? All of those scenarios are considered. The triggers, the properties, the optional scenarios, the failure conditions, the transformations and more. All of those problems are solved. Good stuff, right? Because that means that you can take the next step. You can use that logic to describe all of the things. You do a data inventory on your website. You say, what is the content and the data and information I have about all of my things, about my content, about the authors, about the organization, about my products, about my reviews, about all of that context. And you prioritize where there are opportunities to get rich snippets from those. So Google's documentation will say, for example, you can get shiny result formats for products, or shiny result formats for reviews, or for recipes. Go and see where there's easy wins and intersects. But also find places where you can enrich your data in a way which helps systems to better understand the relationship between those things and all of your juicy context. That is the basics. That gets you to step 1. And it will give you something that looks like this. This is the same article I just showed you on Yoast.com, shown in the structured data testing tool. That's now been deprecated, but it's still useful for visualizing. You can see the raw schema code on the left, and on the right, you can see how Google might parse and understand the entities we're describing. And you can see all of their properties gets pretty dense. This is just an article. It has text, an author, a description, but it also has a published date, copyright information, information about the website that it's on, information about the organization who publishes the website that the web page is on, information about how many employees that organization has, information about the author, information about the author's place of birth, etc., etc. This kind of framework allows you to scale and adapt and enrich and really help search engines and other systems understand all of these things. Because, for example, if I can help Google to understand that I am an expert in structured data, that might change how they interpret, crawl, index, rank, serve, or present an article that I write about structured data. All of these things connect to help them better understand how they should be serving their content. There are 3 ways you can build this sort of stuff. If you're lucky enough that your sites are already on WordPress, then Yoast already does all of this automatically out of the box for you. You don't even need to be here. You don't even need to think about that. It's good news, right? But if you want to get more technical and do more stuff, our framework's extensible. That same developer documentation has an open source API that you can use to expand and extend and overwrite and change our logic to do your own thing. That's cool. If you're not on WordPress, I'm so sorry, but also try looking into Schema app or WordLift. These are 2 very powerful, very cool, comprehensive tools that let you define the business logic that constructs and outputs the schema. They have different approaches, different pricing models. Your mileage might vary, but go check them out. What you absolutely shouldn't ever do is follow all the SEO advice on the internet which says something like, oh, you can code this yourself, or oh, you can use something like Google Tag Manager to inject it. These approaches are fundamentally brittle. Yes, you can copy-paste some code using this and maybe get some rich results for your recipe, but you're never going to be able to describe the complex interwoven relationships between all the entities because things change. If your organization's opening hours change, you don't want to have to manually update the schema on every page of your site which describes the relationship between the author of a blog post and the company they work for, etc., etc. That was a lot to digest. And I promised you we were going to go beyond the basics. So I want to give you some context that not a lot of people see and not a lot of people think about, because I think that this is the really interesting stuff when it comes to schema. Google is not the only consumer of schema.org markup. And a lot of the narrative and what I've focused on so far is about how we can provide Google with the kinds of things they need to better understand the web. They are not the only consumer. And that's interesting because Google's approach to schema is in areas opinionated, challenging, problematic, and generally interesting. We'll come back to that in a bit. In the meantime, bear in mind as we go forwards that when you're looking at schema, there are other systems and opportunities that it might be worth feeding this kind of information to get results. So, for example, Pinterest supports schema. And they have a different approach to Google. In particular, you can define references and relationships to other URLs on other domains. Pinterest's data model has an idea of outward connections to other resources in a way that Google doesn't. But whilst that's philosophically interesting, their adoption is extremely limited, and this is just about all of it. There's not a lot here to play with. Facebook do some really cool stuff with schema if you're selling through Facebook Catalog and you're running a Facebook pixel on your site. They will read your product price and availability schema and automatically update your catalog and inventory detail in their systems in a way which means you don't need to use expensive and complex XML feeds, for example. If you set this up, your website and its data becomes the primary source of truth for your e-commerce outlets and availability. I think that's pretty cool. However, beyond that, again, things are pretty limited. Bing, if anyone remembers them, offers some rudimentary schema support, but again, there's no depth or sophistication here, odds and ends of rich results, but they're not really doing a huge amount. And Yandex haven't done anything with schema since 2013. Now, the schema.org homepage says many applications from Google, Pinterest, Microsoft, Yandex, and others already use schema.org to power rich, extensible experiences. I think that might be stretching the truth a little. Because Google, practically speaking, is the only consumer. And they don't always adhere precisely to schema.org. They bend the rules where it's helpful for them, which means that in some places they blur the lines between what's technically defined in schema.org and how they prefer to consume schema.org markup. For example, according to Google, a recipe must have an image. And whilst image is a valid property for recipe in schema.org, schema.org has no concept of requiredness. But Google's ecosystem can't conceive of a recipe without a picture. How do blind people cook? But it's messier than that. An article must have an author and a publisher, but a publisher can't be a person and must have a valid logo. What happens if I publish my own content? Local business can't have split opening hours within a single day, except large parts of Europe siesta after lunch and close. The logo of a publisher of a news article must have different requirements than one for an organisation if it's on an AMP page. But what happens if that organisation is the same organisation? An article must have a main entity of page property, but FAQ markup must have a main entity property on the web page. And whilst that sounds similar, it is the opposite approach, and these relationships don't play nicely with each other. I could go on and on and on. I'm going to skip some of this because we're a little short on time. One of the big challenges when you're trying to work out how you work around this is that you need to be able to identify all of the things. Because we've said the way you cross-relate and build and define relationships between entities is via their IDs. Except there isn't a standard way to do this, and all of Google's documentation is entirely conflicting and different, and breadcrumbs work differently from recipes, etc., etc. And if I have multiple systems like a CMS and a third-party review platform and a tag management system, the only way we can combine their schema is via using IDs. So if we want all of this to work, we need a consistent standard. Good. Here's another thing I've spent hundreds of hours on. Again, developer.yoast.com. There's a lot of... This is not a plug for Yoast. I'm a big Yoast fan. I work for Yoast. I think Yoast is a great solution. I just think that these resources did not exist. We have created them. This is all open source. Feel free to go and use them, expand them, adopt them, change them, etc., etc. I think this is the best way to do this. I have solved, quote we have solved the ID problem. All of this exists. Interestingly, also, all of their tools are inconsistent. This is better since they've deprecated the structured data testing tool, but they now have the rich results tool and another couple, and they all provide different results and different stylings and different feedbacks. This is really frustrating. However, it's worth acknowledging that Google really still is the only major consumer, at least in the terms of search, of the only major adopter and people pushing that adoption. A lot of the adoption that exists in Schema today is because of Google offering tactical rewards. But now that we have that adoption and the industry is starting to think about Schema and wrap its head around it, maybe we can think about what happens next. Maybe there are opportunities to peek behind the curtain. Maybe you have commercial or altruistic motivations to add to or alter or extend or influence Schema.org itself or Google's adoption of it. Because Schema.org, the website, the standard, are all open source. And in principle, anyone can contribute. They can get involved, they can help shape it, extend it, or define new rules for new areas and vocabularies. And if everyone except for Google seems to have abandoned the ship a little, maybe it would be healthy for some of us to have voices in those echo chambers. For example, there is no schema for anything to do with animals, which means if you operate a chain of pet stores or sell pet food or veterinary clinics, there is no way to utilize schema to define those services and products in detail. So maybe there are opportunities in areas like that to shape the standard in ways which better align to your needs or our needs or to Google's needs, for example. How might that work? This is really interesting. Schema as a standard is a far from static thing. It has relatively regular new releases and they launch new stuff and new content. Loads of new features, like when I took this screenshot, they just made ski resort a new subclass of resort, which is oddly niche but quite interesting. But when you start to read this, the question comes up of how does this work? And who are they? Who are the people who are defining these standards? Well, you can browse through the schema.org website. They have a how we work page, which gives us some clues. There's a workflow where pending schema types and fixes work their way through a pipeline. But before that, there are discussions on a W3C community group and in the project's GitHub tracker. Okay, so this is where the discussions happen. Let's go check out. Well, maybe not. This is the W3C working group for Schema, and it has about 400 members, but the only post on the page is from 2015, and it's a welcome to this new group placeholder message. It does have some links in the sidebar, though, about how the group operates. Maybe we're just not seeing the behind-the-scenes discussions because we're not members of the group. We can go and take a look. This is the page about how new issues and ideas and suggestions are handled. It's from 2016, and it hasn't been updated since. But it does say that anyone can open issues or join discussions on the GitHub area, which will be tagged and categorized and triaged and moved through a kind of workflow. We have found where this lives. Except when we look at that schema.org GitHub repository, which is public, you can go to this URL, you can go find it, Google GitHub schema.org. This is a bit of a soup. When I took the screenshot, there were over 500 open issues. And as we can see, many of them haven't been interacted with and certainly aren't tagged and classified. And these are a mix of help requests, big architectural projects, spam, some tweaks to existing standards, crazy ideas, small ideas, etc. Many haven't been responded to and still need triaging. One of the things that is interesting is when you look where there are active discussions, the same face shows up and over and over again on all the active threads. And as you dig back a page or two, you see a second face that keeps cropping up. He was on holiday for a few weeks when I took the screenshots, otherwise he would have been there all the time. There are two people here who triage all these issues. This is Dan Brickley on the left and Richard Wallace on the right. These are key people. Dan works for Google and is the de facto owner and one of the creators of Schema.org, the website and the standard. Richard is an independent consultant on all things structured data, but works on Google's behalf to manage aspects of maintaining the Schema.org website, and because of his proximity to it, is also heavily involved in the standard. So if we were to cynically ask, how do new ideas or features get added to Schema.org, or how do I affect significant change to parts of that ecosystem? The answer might be through one or both of these two. Now I should race to say that both of these are lovely, unbiased experts, and they go to great lengths to remain unbiased and not just to become Google, not just to play the Google fiddle, etc. And there are some other non-Google folks who show up frequently in these ecosystems. However, this does further go to underline the question of what is the distinction between Schema.org and Google's interpretation of Schema.org. Are we just feeding Google data about our businesses and our products in a way that makes our websites and our marketing redundant, in a way that might mean that they could build a system which means that our businesses can't access markets because they solve the problems in the search results? There are challenging questions here. But it gets more interesting as we dig, because as you look through, you can see that Dan and Richard are looking swamped. Their current approach for managing the Schema.org website and the standard in the pipeline is under strain. In May last year, Dan opened an issue to address the fact that the stated process of how they would classify and organise and work through issues that came in wasn't working. They have way too many open tickets. And this ticket, when you dig into it, is an existential crisis about how discussions, ideas and feature requests for Schema.org should work. And the conclusion was that feature requests should be separated out into a different GitHub repository. Here it is. This is the Suggestions, Questions, Brainstorming repository, very interestingly named. And it has about 200-ish open issues. And whilst it looks like there's some active discussion on some of them, many of these comments are actually notifications that issues have been marked as stale and closed due to inactivity. If I were a cynic, I might call this a graveyard. Though in fairness, many of these issues are old, and the problem is actually that there's not much new discussion happening. Except when you go back to the main repository and you search all of the open tickets and issues for the word Google. There are quite a few examples of these issues and tickets which have been specifically opened as requests from or on behalf of teams from and employees from Google. These particular examples were opened in late last July and August, and by November had already made it into the pending Schema.org standards, and now several of which are part of the main Schema.org standard. This is a very different story to the many tickets that have languished for months or years or been relegated to the graveyard. Now, to be fair to Google, they're not the only organisation who are active in these kinds of discussions. This, for example, is a conversation which spanned for weeks, discussing what a specification for homepage might look like. And the premise is that I think it's a bit odd that Schema.org allows you to define subtypes of web pages like FAQ pages and contact pages, but there is no concept of homepage. We have web pages, websites, organisations that all share the same URL, the homepage URL, but I can't define that. So this conversation involves Dan Brickley and Richard Wallace from just now and a handful of others. It's fascinating, it's nerdy, it's challenging, it's frustrating, and Dan archived it. Not because it's right or wrong or because it's not a good idea, but because even if we do collectively come to an agreement on how this should work and define a homepage, there is no large-scale consumer of Schema.org currently looking to use it. unless a large-scale consumer expresses a demand for a specific type of schema markup, then it's unlikely to be added to the standard. The page on schema.org says as much. It talks about how schema.org can be extended. It says that once upon a time it was freely extensible and you just added stuff, but that didn't really work. So they changed it to tie in with hosted extensions, third-party libraries they could bolt onto and integrate with. But then it made more sense to integrate those things directly into Schema. So now they encourage discussion on the GitHub repository, but only prioritize issues which are likely to be consumed. Google is the only large-scale consumer of schema.org. If I were more cynical, I might take a leaf out of my good friend Barry Adams' book, who's a prominent SEO who is very anti-Google on these types of topics, because it might feel like schema.org is something of a Google monopoly. You could make an argument that it seems to be run solely by Google employees, prioritizing Google's agenda for Google's benefit, potentially at the expense of individual webmasters who are feeding and fueling that machine. You could make the same kind of arguments that Barry does about AMP, about unfair advantages, preferential treatments, and of Google forcing their own version of the open web, where the definition of open might become somewhat blurry. In fairness to Google, they have just as equally used their powers for incredible good in ways which would have been hard to achieve otherwise. When the COVID pandemic first hit, within days, Schema.org had turned around a new standard for special announcement, which had been discussed in GitHub involving employees from Google and from Yoast and from other places. And they launched this in a way that it meant that immediately hospitals, schools, pharmacies, public buildings could implement special announcement schema, which would show up in Google and say, our opening hours have changed. Our policies on visiting have changed. We're closed. This kind of critical information, which might well have helped save lives. Google's used their leverage in schema to do incredible good in a way which would have been hard to do otherwise. So I don't think this monopoly, something close to it, is intentionally evil, or even necessarily intentional. I think there's a symptom here of broader issues of distribution of power on the web, and that would-be competitors like Facebook, Amazon and Pinterest are focusing on their own walled gardens rather than the open web. The way in which schema.org, the standard and the website, has evolved has been entirely organic. It's been experimental. There's no deception or power play here, just a mess that we're observing from the outside in. And even if schema.org is just essentially a structured language for Google, as a result of that accidental organic growth, that doesn't mean that it can't still be valuable for the open web and be good in ways beyond just feeding Google. Think, for example, for a moment, what is Google's competitive advantage? I would posit that it's understanding the web, as we've discussed. It's crawling, storing, processing, and then connecting the dots between all those entities. But broad schema adoption, beyond the specific bits that Google rewards, levels the playing field. If schema.org is on, if every restaurant site in the world has schema that describes their menu, now I don't need billions or trillions of dollars to build a Google competitor to crawl and scrape and process and understand the web. I can just extract that information directly from those websites. You want to create a search engine that grabs the opening hours of all vegan restaurants within a 30-kilometer radius of a sports venue. It takes a day, not a decade. That is all we've got time for today. That's a lot to digest. I think a quick wrap up on what on earth you do with all of that, because there's a lot to think about. The key thing I want you to think about is that schema.org is much more and much more important than just the rich snippets that Google provides and rewards you with in the search results. There is an ecosystem here of communication, of marketing, an opportunity to describe the things that we are and say and do and have in a way that helps Google and others to understand those fundamentally in a way that they struggle to do without that kind of information. And that might unlock new tactical opportunities. It might unlock new strategic integrations. It might unlock a future where there are other search engines. It might unlock competitive integrations and opportunities. There are huge potential areas we can explore here that we're just not at the moment. From a technical perspective, Build a strong foundation using the graph and ID approach that I described that comes automatically straight out of Yoast when you're running it on WordPress. I see some comments popping up in the chat. All the stuff I've talked about, Yoast SEO does automatically in Yoast SEO free because we've built it that way. And you can extend that using the developer documentation I pointed out via the API, which is all open source, and you can build on top of that and do your own thing. Or if you're not on WordPress, Schema app and WordProof are very good alternatives to go and do your own thing. Please implement Schema, which Google doesn't explicitly reward with rich results, so that other people can start to use it or to encourage Google to support it. More importantly, potentially debate and discuss and cause Google to want to pursue things. If all the big veterinary supplies retailers in the world, or all the big pet shops, or all the big animal charities said, actually, you know what, we think that there's a valuable opportunity to describe animals. This one has 4 legs, this one has a beak, this one has fur, in a way that maybe helps us, I don't know, provide audiences with the best type of medicine or treatment or location or suitable pet advice or any other thing. We can create that noise, we can have those conversations, and we can say on GitHub and in other areas, yes, there is demand for this kind of information. And remember, when I say Google, in this context, there isn't a big faceless conglomerate. There are 2 people. There is Dan Brickley and Richard Wallace and a bunch of non-Googles on GitHub just waiting to be convinced by your good ideas. Please wade in. Like this, like we have, where in the SEO world, there are challenges in the overlaps between how Meta Robots data works and how Schema data works. And which one wins can get quite complex. We've suggested an approach which reconciles those, which is under discussion, which has a whole bunch of different interesting ideas. We are going to change the shape of the web and the future of data and how brands and systems consume information about how websites should be crawled and indexed just because no one else has. Think about how many competitive opportunities there are to change the shape of how the web works, and come and get involved. Please explore schema.org, the website, not just the individual things you can mark up, but the information pages, the history, the background, the how we work stuff. There are so many interesting things in here that go far beyond even just SEO. Please, if you're interested in the technical side of this, go to developer.yoast.com and browse through the schema section. We've got reams of stuff we've written about the philosophy of the approach, the way things stitch together, how your local business schema should change if you are a dentist who doesn't have a logo and only opens on the weekend, and you can build stuff on that and you can extend it and customize it and integrate. If you're still skeptical about the value of all of this, do some Googling. I couldn't find a specific link in the time I put these slides together, but there are a whole bunch of really good blog posts about using schema data to pass information to your analytics setup to better understand how different types of pages and content are working. We do this on Yoast.com. We extract the schema information from our some of our metrics and some of our data. We pass that to analytics. We use it to find opportunities to improve our pages. It makes us a ton of money. It's really, really effective. That's definitely worth doing. If all of this was a bit much, or if you want to learn more, I have wrangled you do not tell anyone. I wrangled you a top secret discount code that is valid until Monday, I think. This is valid for Yoast Academy, which is a whole thing we have on Yoast.com. Yoast SEO Academy has reams of courses and learning you can do, online training and videos. There is 10% off if you use Jono_SE ranking 10. You just need to go through and buy the Academy Plus Premium bundle. I didn't put a link in because I just threw this slide together, but I'm sure you can find it. It's in the Learn section on our main nav. Go and check it out. It's a really good resource. I'm a speaker in a whole bunch of the videos. It's really up to date. It's really top notch. It's one of the best resources out there. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening through that. I appreciate that. Was one heck of a deep dive. That's all we've got time for. No, we've got time for some questions, I think, but that's certainly me needing to take a breath and drink some water. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jono. That was definitely a lot to soak in, and you just sort of ran through that. So we are gonna send out a replay and the presentation so you can follow along and zoom in on everything that is interesting for you. But right now we have the best part of the online part of the webinar is the perk of having the opportunity to ask Jono a question. Yeah. So we already have one rolling in from Noor. Let me put it up on the screen. So what type of schema should be used for affiliate marketing?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I don't have a great answer. So this is difficult. Google is yes, Google is not the only provider, but if you want the tactical rewards, Google is very, very opinionated when it comes to how products should be described with schema. They have to have an offer, and that offer has to have at least reviews or ratings or some kind of feedback. And a lot of that assumes that I am the person selling this. You might, it depends. If you've got a price and you're getting your own reviews, then you could do that. You could try and just do a partial product. I presume this is a product, not a service. It might be a service. There is a whole bunch of schema for services rather than products. Go look at Google's help page for product and offer schema and see if you can meet all the required pieces. If not, check out Makes Offer. You'll Google that and have a look on schema.org. There is a whole subset of schema for describing a person or organization asking to either buy or sell a thing. That's quite common in marketplace type setups, like I make offer for product or I seek offer to buy product. There's some interesting stuff in there. It's worth exploring.
Thank you, Jono. The next question we have from Anastasia. So if I use a WordPress plugin, do I need to submit the structural code to the source file, or does the plugin do that for me?
Good question. It will depend which plugin you're using. If you're using Yoast SEO, we do all this automatically. The only thing you need to do is go into your plugin settings and define the name of your organization or person and upload a logo. And then we work out all the rest and do it magically. Other plugins tend to require you to go and type or paste some schema in either on a page-by-page basis or a template basis. Have a look around, see which one's the best fit. If you're not WordPress, you said WordPress plugin, but also it might be worth looking at Schema app and WordLift. They're both good alternatives.
Great, thanks. Next question from Senya. Other than making a site easier to crawl, what exactly is it about schema markup that helps improve search rankings?
So I should be really careful. Schema does not affect search rankings at all, at least in Google, but it might change how your result is shown. You might get shiny stars or a review or a picture or rich information, but it might also make you eligible to be featured in places you wouldn't otherwise, like your product image might get a little buy now link in Google image search, which it wouldn't be able to otherwise. And then even more interestingly, it will allow you to compete in places where you essentially have to have schema to access, like the recipes ecosystem. If you Google any recipe, you will notice that all of the results on the page are rich, shiny, interactive cards with calorie counts and images and estimated times. That is all powered by schema. If you don't have schema on your recipe, there is no way you will compete in that space because Google understands that it's not as useful a result. You'll get poorer click-through rate, which is a negative feedback signal for user engagement, which will further decrease your ranking, etc. So schema will never make you rank higher, but it might make you rank differently, and it might make you rank in different places, and it might make your existing ranking more competitive. And then aside from all of that, it will help Google and other systems to understand your content in a way that might have other secondary effects.
Great, thank you once again. The next question we have from Ray. The key issue for me is what tool to use to generate the schema code. For example, Merkle and Hall only have a very limited set of things. What do you recommend? Thanks.
Yeah, the same story. Either Yoast if you're using WordPress, and if you're not, Schema app or WordLift, because they will walk you through a process of, okay, what have we got in the database? What do we have on the page? Can we extract the author information? Can we tie this together? And they make all of that super easy.
Great. The next one we have from Pavel. Our client is a hospital. We use WordPress together with Yoast, but we have had structured data markup problem once. We solved it, however, and I'd like to know how to check if everything is well connected. What tool is best for this?
That's a great question. So there are two tools. One, so you want to check it's all connected, well connected, use Classy Schema. ClassySchema.org, there is a visualizer tool on it. You paste your schema in, and there's a button you can click to say show visualization. It gives you one of those nice spider diagrams I showed earlier. That will let you see very quickly, is it broken? Are there multiple bits floating around, or is this a nice connected network? And it should be one spider structure. If it's not, you might have problems. So the other answer is Google's rich results test or the Google Schema Validator. However, both of these are opinionated, and they will show warnings and errors when there aren't warnings and errors. So they will, for example, say your product must have an ISBN number. And it might be that your product doesn't have an ISBN number, and they will show a warning. It might be that your product is a unique product that you have handmade and will never ever have an ISBN number, but they insist that it has one. So there are lots of cases where you might see warnings and errors and suggestions in a big scary orange font. the UI is rubbish, which aren't actually problematic. This is the case on all sorts of schema. They say you're missing these 30 recommended properties, and quite often they just won't make sense. So yeah, start with classy schema for is it structurally correct, and then Google's testing tools, the rich result tester, validator.schema.org to see what's Google's opinionated take on this.
Great. Thank you. The next one question is from Vlad. What do you think of the data highlighter tool in Google Search Console? Obviously, it just applies to Google and not other search engines, but it's a really quick way of quickly tagging data fields.
Is that still around? I remember using that about 100 years ago. I hadn't realized that was still there. I presume that's you have to navigate into the go to classic mode in Google Search Console and use it in there. I remember that. So it gives you you can click on things on the page and say this bit of HTML is the price and this is the image, and it extracts that and learns from it. If I recall correctly, that's based on microformats rather than schema.org, and that was similar stuff but a slightly different technology. I would be amazed if they're still doing anything with that. If it's still kicking around in the depths of the old Search Console, I would be hesitant about relying on that, especially when there's better, more up-to-date ways of doing this. And the standards have changed a lot since that tool was released.
Right, so that probably you should check up if it still is around, the data highlighter tool. Okay, thank you. We have another question from Mitchell. Is there an online tool where you can create schema markup? I mean, a site that gives us the basic scheme code for a product, and then we just edit, copy, and paste it.
Yeah, there's tons. Just Google it, Google schema.org generator. However, I really wouldn't recommend it. Again, the problem is, okay, you generate a bunch of schema code for a product and you put it on your page. Your product goes out of stock. Your schema.org is now incorrect. You are incorrectly, your price changes. There's now, you're eligible for being barred from rich results for that format. If Google detect it, they'll say you're misrepresenting. Best case, you just don't get the shiny results. Worst case, they say, nope, you're banned. That's a potentially legal issue, misrepresenting prices. There's all sorts of other issues connected to this. It just becomes very fragile and brittle. You really want either something like a Yoast that reads and manages the data in real time, or a schema app or WordLift that does extraction and other mechanisms. Anything that you just copy paste is going to be super brittle and super fragile. So unless you're just doing really simple static stuff, be really careful with that. Oh, also, I've seen examples where having inconsistent data between schema.org and the page, like the price change, also might ban you from AdWords because they detect that the differences mean that you're misrepresenting things and they get very upset. So yeah, be super careful with that.
Yeah, very delicate area. Thank you. The next question from Gautier. Can I use schema in my Shopify store?
Yes, many Shopify templates come with some schema out the box. Many Shopify apps come with additional schema. It is not as mature and sophisticated an ecosystem as WordPress, but you can cherry pick bits. You won't easily be able to build a rich connected graph, like I've said, because of some limitations of the platform, but you should be able to get the basics in. You should be able to unlock some of the rich results. I would look at Google's rich results documentation, see what types of schema there are, see what types of content you have that match up to that, and then go hunting for Shopify apps.
Great. I hope that helped, Gautier. Moving on to a question from Doug. How do I manage my content and schema markup to help identify specific snippets of text that I would like to see served up by the voice search engines?
That is an excellent question. So there is a specific type of schema for this called Speakable, which I have hummed and hawed for about 2 years about trying to see if we can prioritize implementing in Yoast. And we haven't because it's still in beta and I don't see anybody adopting it. It's a really clunky format. You've got to say this specific section of text on the page via a CSS selector or an XPath selector is viable to be read out. And there's all sorts of complexity with that. Very, very few people have adopted it. I think Google will become and already are becoming smart enough to not need that, and they will just understand this is the article headline, this is the first paragraph, this is a summary. You can help there are some good ideas, things like FAQ schema, nice, what is the question, what is the answer stuff is going to be more eligible. How-to guides are really good. Recipes are actually incidentally a subset of how-to guides. I talked about subtypes and being more specific. A recipe is just a subtype of how-to guide. Those kinds of short, structured, am I answering the query type content will be really helpful. Use lots of headings and subheadings, structure your content in nice digestible chunks. Don't just have a wall of unbroken text. Try and make it speakable. But yeah, I wouldn't hedge your bets necessarily on the speakable schema specifically.
Thank you once again. The next question we have comes in from Rin. So, Jono, how does Yoast plugin do with a local and worldwide company that provides online sessions for the entire world, like a psychotherapist?
Oh, that's really interesting. So if you were a physical brick and mortar building with outlets in different cities, I would say use the Yoast local add-on, and that does a whole bunch of that schema. Online stuff is a little trickier. There, in theory, the schema shouldn't matter, but Google quite likes an event to have a location, and the schema for virtual and online events is not great. It was rushed out at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and it's a little bit shaky. Tweet me afterwards or get hold of me on LinkedIn or something, and we'll have a look, because that's a really interesting challenge. How do I provide local, global, remote services is a great question, because there are many businesses who operate this way, right? The walls have been broken down, everything's remote and virtual. I should have a much better answer for that, and we'll find one for you.
Great. So Rin, make sure to reach out to Jono to get further information on this. So next question comes from Fabrizio. Which WordPress schema plugin do you recommend?
I mean, I have to say Yoast, right?
Right.
And yes, I work for Yoast, and yes, I think Yoast is great. Yes, yada yada yada. However, I genuinely believe the Yoast schema implementation is the most sophisticated one on the web, and I believe that because I've spent 2 years living it and writing it and speccing it and testing it and debugging it and working on the API internally. It aims to be magical, and then also extensible and flexible. So yeah, there are others. If you want to do specific niche stuff that we don't support, definitely just go out and find the best ones. If you want to write your own, there are good solutions for that. If you're not using Yoast, other SEO platforms provide schema stuff in a lot of their plugins. I don't think it's as good, but yeah, do your research.
Great. Next question from Marius. What is the main downside of implementing structured data through Google Tag Manager?
Great question. So one is the brittleness angle that I've discussed. Like if your price changes and your GTM logic isn't smart enough to catch that, then you might have mismatched issues. And also, for example, if another example I had earlier, if part of the graph that's like a shared piece, like the address of the organization that publishes the article changes, it can be a real pain to refactor that in GTM. More interestingly, I think one of the arguments is that it's reliant on JavaScript, which means that Facebook and Bing and Yandex and Pinterest are going to struggle in a way that Google might not. And if we're talking about the open web and everything consuming this kind of data, it really needs to be server-side. Like as soon as we're moving stuff into JavaScript, it becomes a bit more brittle and unreliable. But also, it's loading after the stuff on the page is loaded. So I have the schema that loads on the page that says 6 cats, and then the GTM stuff that loads and says 8 dogs. Which one wins? Or is it both? Or is it 8 cats or 6 dogs? And there's the reconciliation question of I've got 2 different versions of the truth. And Google does quite a good job of just layering that together, but other systems don't. And again, if we're saying that maybe there's value in an ecosystem here that isn't just a way to feed Google all of your critical and valuable business information, I would be looking at trying to do a more universal implementation.
Thank you. Thank you. We also have a follow-up question from Mitchell. So how do you add the schema into Yoast? Let's say a product page that has an FAQ. Where's the code entered in Yoast?
You don't need to. You don't need to add any code. We do it automatically. It's all based on what's in the content and on the page. If you use a Yoast FAQ block in the content, we pick that up, we stitch it in. If it's a product page in WooCommerce, you might need to be using our WooCommerce add-on if you're using Woo, but we pick it all up and we do it automatically. It's all hands off. That was part of the idea is as an author and as a real person doing real stuff, you shouldn't have to be copy-pasting schema. You should be doing real stuff and we should work it all out.
Amazing. Great answer. Okay. I only see one more question. So if you guys have any more questions, this is the time to ask them. We have one final one for the time being from Ismail. Can I have multiple types of schema on a single page? And the next part of the question is, will Google show both in search results?
That is an excellent question with a very long and laborious answer. Yes, you can have multiple types of schema on a single page, and the kinds of graph connected network solutions I was talking about do. If I have a recipe that has a video and an image written by an author who's a person that works for an organization, there's 8 different types of schema there, and that's just scraping the surface. Google won't show both types, but they might show different types in different scenarios. So sometimes they might show, with the recipe example, it might make sense sometimes for them to show a video, sometimes it might make sense for them to show an image, sometimes it might make sense for them to show a how-to guide. And that's going to be in part based on the query, the user, the device that's being queried on, and a whole bunch of other scenarios. Also, some types trump other types. And this changes depending on what Google are doing. But at the moment, I think FAQ beats event and event beats recipe. I've played around with a bunch of these and it seems really arbitrary, but some of them seem more strong than others. It might be coincidence, but yeah, some of the more question and answer type formats will beat the more generic ones. So yeah, you're not going to get all 10 results in the search results, but it's worth thinking about all the different types of things that are on a page so that you can be eligible for all of those.
All right, awesome. This was a great Q&A session. I hope everyone had the opportunity and used it to ask the question. Obviously, this is a topic that needs some time to be absorbed properly. So, guys, make sure to rewatch this. And if you have any questions further on for Jono, you can always reach out to him via LinkedIn or tweet him. Oh, we actually have one more question from Piotr. I found that a lot of big Sorry, 2 more questions. I found that a lot of big e-commerce sites use aggregate offer in place where product model. Sorry, I'm not bringing it up on the screen. My bad.
That's a good question. Yeah, so a lot of e-commerce sites use aggregate offer instead of product model. You are absolutely right, and it is wrong. But that's because product model and similar stuff is pretty new. So the way you describe variation products, like here is a t-shirt that is available in red and in green and in small and in large, is really hard in Schema. And actually a lot of those standards only dropped about a year ago, so they're all pretty new. Historically, yeah, all of the big e-commerce sites use aggregate offer, which so you say there are 8 different offers for this and there are 8 different variations. Technically, you're meant to use that in the case of here are multiple places and formats you can buy this in, like a listing site saying here are 8 different, like an affiliate site saying here are 8 different options. Yeah, it's really bad. Google accepts it and makes a reasonable job of it, but semantically and technically it's wrong. This is something we're working on at the moment in some of the Yoast stuff. We want to get it right. There is a spec, we've got it, it's just not quite rolled out yet. But yeah, there's a much more graceful way of doing that. That unlocks a whole bunch of problems with crawling and indexing though. Like if I have a t-shirt in 10 sizes and 10 colors, suddenly that is a lot of unique URLs and it's really inefficient from an SEO perspective. So we're talking to Google about ways that we might refine that spec a bit.
Wonderful. And the last question from Mitchell. Just wants to reiterate that this is all. So just to clarify, all I need to do is write a blog post as I normally do. And just by having Yoast, 100% of the schema markup possible will be sorted automatically.
Not all of it that's possible, like all of it that makes sense for us to do that we can do, yes. We will say this is an article written by a person for this organization, etc. We won't say, and this was this person's height, because we don't know. Though actually we did just release a feature where you can say their pronouns and their honorific suffixes and things. So you can do some of that. But we don't do all the possible schema because there's 1,500 different properties, many of which won't make sense or which we don't have access to. But we will do all of the good schema that makes sense for the type of content that you've published. If you want to get nerdy and technical, you should definitely expand on top of that and do stuff that we don't know because we can't guess. We don't know that you're a butcher or a baker. We don't know that you're only open on Tuesdays. You can add that kind of context.
Right. Thank you. I just want to write your contact details into the chat because people are already wondering how to reach out to you.
It's going to be a busy weekend.
I'm going to drop your Twitter handle in the chat. One sec. Here's the Twitter handle. And yeah, you can find him on LinkedIn just using the same information, guys. Yeah. So if we didn't get to some of your guys' questions, we're going to cut it here. But be sure to reach out to Jono for follow-up information. I just want to remind everyone that we have a special offer from Jono for the Yoast Academy, so make sure to check that out. And we also have a special extended free trial for SE Ranking if you guys haven't tried that yet. So be sure to go ahead and find that link in the chat that I threw in earlier. All right, thank you, Jono, for joining us. This was very interesting, even for a non-techie person like myself. So I got to know a bit more, and it looks very interesting, and definitely something that we should all move forward to help Google understand us better, to tell our stories.
Nice.
And thank you guys
so much. Yeah, thanks to the audience. Thanks for you for hosting. Thanks, SE Ranking. Thanks for the audience. Some of those questions were phenomenal. That was the best set of feedback I've had talking about this sort of stuff. You guys were great. Definitely get in touch if you've got more questions, and definitely check out Joost and SE Ranking. Go do your homework. Got nothing to do this weekend, right? Let's do some Schema.
Great. Thank you. And so thank you, everyone, once again for joining us. And we'll look forward to doing this again with you. And stay safe, everyone. We're going to end it here. Bye.